Module 7, we'll be discussing one of my favorite and I believe most useful topics in the conflict course, how to negotiate effectively. In this module, we're going to discuss why you should ask for things and why you probably don't. I'll describe for you a principled approach to negotiation. Then I'll lay out a few basic principles in Negotiation 101, and we'll complete this module by discussing some effective communication strategies that you can use during negotiation. I believe that once you finish this module, you will have developed a set of skills that you can use in any part of your life for the rest of your life. Let's get started. You may be wondering why I have an entire lesson on why you should ask and why you probably don't. Well, before you can negotiate, you have to begin by asking. And for many people, the most difficult part of the negotiation process is simply beginning it. Many people are taught not to ask for things. And those people are often taught that they should wait for things to come to them, that if they do a good job, they'll get what they deserve. Unfortunately, the research does not support this claim. A lot of research shows that people who ask for things and negotiate effectively are much more successful in their lives, both professionally and personally. So before we even begin talking about how to negotiate, I want to spend a little bit of time convincing you that it's important that you learn to negotiate, that you practice it, and you use it in every aspect of your life. Before we even begin talking about why you should ask, I'd like you first to complete the Attitudes Toward Negotiating scale. You can locate that scale by clicking on the link on this page. Once you answer all of the questions, you can determine your overall comfort with asking and negotiating by adding the odd numbers and dividing by 5. To determine your overall asking and negotiating activity, add the even numbers and divide by 5. There may be several questions that don't apply to you, such as, how often do you negotiate with suppliers? For those questions, answer how comfortable you think you would be in those situations and how likely you think you would be to negotiate in those circumstances. Once you've averaged your score, you should come up with a number between 1 and 5. In this case, the lower your number, the more comfortable you are and the more likely you are to negotiate in the various circumstances. If you look on the second page of the scale, you'll find some additional information on how you can analyze your scores. Of course, one of the most obvious reasons that you need to ask is that if you don't ask, you often don't get. I'm not telling you to ask for anything and everything and all the time. Rather, I want you to think about what's appropriate to ask for in the given circumstance with that particular person, and then go ahead and ask for it. If you've looked ahead to the discussion post from Module 7, you may remember that you're required to ask for several things over the course of a week before you write your post. I have you do that because I want you to understand and learn the power of asking. For the discussion question post, I don't expect you to negotiate. At that point, all I want you to do is simply ask, nothing else. When I tell you that asking is important, I don't expect you to just believe me. However, you should believe the research conducted by Linda Babcock. Professor Babcock is the Dean of Economics at Cornell University. When she was Dean of that program, she began to look at the starting salaries of the students who graduated from her MBA program. When she looked at that data, she was surprised to discover that the men in her program were receiving starting salaries of about $5,000 more than were the women receiving. And this surprised her because the women in her program typically had higher GRE scores coming in, earned higher grades, and had more experience. And so she began to wonder, why is it that men who were probably less qualified receiving higher salaries than were the women? To answer that question, she conducted a number of studies that resulted in many articles and ultimately 2 books, both of which are popular press books and have been very successful. Those books are called Women Don't Ask, and the second one is Ask For It. Essentially what she found is that negotiating your salary, especially your starting salary right out of college, has long-term consequences for you and for your family. We're going to look at her findings in more detail throughout the rest of this lesson. If you look at these graphs, you can understand why Babcock argues that whether or not you negotiate your starting salary out of college has long-term consequences. If you look at that first graph on the left, and then look at the first comparison on the far left, you'll see that people who negotiated their salaries coming out of their MBA programs earned $5,600 on average more than those who did not negotiate. And you'll notice that she estimated that the people were around the age of 30 when they left their MBA program. So during the first year of employment, those who negotiated their salaries started out $5,600 more. 35 years later, when they retired, the gap had grown to $15,758 more per year. Now, this is assuming that they negotiate in the same way throughout the rest of their careers. So the only difference would be their first initial negotiation, and then all other negotiations would be the same. But because one person started with a higher salary, each of their raises is going to be higher. So at the end of 35 years, they're going to be making $15,758 more. Now, that may not sound like a lot of money. However, if you think about that money compounded over 35 years, you find out that people who did a one-time negotiation, their starting salaries that got them $5,600 more, ended up earning $361,172 more over their lifetime career. Now imagine you'd taken that difference and invested it. You'd have well over $500,000 at retirement. Also imagine that you didn't just do a one-time negotiation, but because you're the kind of person that will negotiate salaries, you negotiate your salary every time a salary negotiation is possible. At that point, you're looking at probably $1 million or more over the lifetime of your career. Now you understand why negotiating your first salary is so important and why I include an entire module on negotiation. I do so because negotiating is one of the most important skills that I can teach you for your life. Now I'd like for you to look at the second graph on the PowerPoint to the far right. That's a comparison of the number of women who negotiated and the number of men who negotiated. As the graph reveals, according to Babcock's study, 12.5% of women negotiated their salaries coming out of graduate school compared to 52% of men who did so. This was one of the findings that struck her most, is that even though the women were quite competent, men were 4 times as likely to negotiate their salaries than were women. And it was the fact that men negotiated their starting salaries coming out of graduate school that led them to begin with salaries that were $5,600 greater than were women's. As I mentioned earlier, people who negotiate their salaries consistently can earn up to $1 million more in their lifetimes than people who don't. However, that's just the beginning. There are many other issues you can negotiate, issues that can save you time, money, and energy. Most obviously, we negotiate the price of cars, houses, and other big-ticket items. But we also negotiate with our romantic partners, we negotiate time off with our bosses, and we negotiate with our children. So the ability to negotiate is really valuable. One problem is that depending on the situation, men are anywhere from 4 to 8 to 9 times more likely to negotiate than women. However, remember that in the case of the salary negotiations, 48% of men still didn't negotiate. So this isn't a strictly gendered issue. Linda Babcock conducted a number of interesting studies to determine who is likely to negotiate and, to a lesser extent, why they do so. One study she conducted and replicated at Arizona State University involved the game Boggle. What she did was invite male and female students into a lab to participate in the study. Each person was placed in a room with a one-way mirror where they were given a Boggle game. They were told to play 2 games of Boggle and record their scores. They also been told they'd be paid between $5 and $10 for their participation. After the student finished both rounds of Boggle, a Confederate came in and offered the student $5. Each time the Confederate had a $5 bill and 5 ones, the Confederate would walk up to the student and offer $5. If the student accepted it, the Confederate would say thank you and the student would leave. However, if the student asked for more money, the Confederate would give them what they asked for up to the $10 limit. And again in this study at ASU, as well as other universities and out in the world, men were 8 to 9 times more likely to ask for the upper limits rather than to accept the $5 they were given. Typically, Babcock stops her studies at that point. However, when she was at ASU, we encouraged her to invite the students into another room and ask them why they did or did not negotiate, and we recorded the interaction. Most of the women who did not negotiate said they didn't negotiate because they didn't think it was appropriate or because they didn't think to do it. And the men who did negotiate said they negotiated because they thought, well, there's a range and all I have to do is ask, and they can just say no, nothing bad's going to happen, so I might as well ask. This study, along with other studies that she's conducted, helps us understand why some people negotiate and why some don't. Given all the benefits of negotiating and the relatively low cost in many circumstances, why are so many people reluctant to negotiate? Well, the research has shown there are a variety of reasons. Perhaps the most common reason is people simply don't think to. People typically think of big-ticket items like cars and houses as being something you negotiate, but they don't think about negotiating their everyday lives. If they get a job, they may think, wow, I'm lucky to have a job. I shouldn't press my luck by trying to negotiate my salary. Or when they go out to the store to buy an item and there's a button missing, they don't think to negotiate. And when they go to the grocery store and they see that the sell-by date for meat is about to expire, they don't think to negotiate the price of the meat. So to a large extent, people who don't negotiate don't negotiate because they simply don't think to do so. A second reason is we're not taught to negotiate. Strangely enough, negotiation is a skill that's taught in very few courses, and many people don't take a course in it. Unless your parents are very good negotiators, or you grew up around people who negotiated a lot, or if you came from a culture where negotiation was common, you probably aren't a great negotiator. It's a set of skills that anyone can learn, but we have to be taught. In addition, there are social structures that inhibit asking. In the United States, people don't negotiate as much as people do in many other cultures. And so there's sort of a hesitancy to negotiate, or maybe to frown on people who negotiate as if they're being greedy or wanting too much. This is particularly true when it comes to women. In the United States, women are often expected to be nicer and more generous and less selfish than men. And so when they do ask for things, they're often regarded more negatively than men are evaluated. And we know that women often are responded to more negatively when they do ask for things. So there are reasons that men and women don't ask. Men are more likely not to ask because they don't think to, or they haven't been taught to, or perhaps because they don't see it going on much in the environment, so think that it might be problematic. Women have all these same reasons, plus they have probably learned throughout their lives that when they ask for things, they're going to be responded to negatively. I say negotiation because it was something I always had trouble with. I certainly didn't think to negotiate, and I can tell you for sure my parents did not teach me to negotiate. In fact, my mother very strongly taught me not to ask for anything. When I was a little girl, if we went to someone's house and it was hot and I was thirsty, I wasn't allowed to ask for a glass of water. If someone offered it, I could accept, but I was told it was impolite to ask for things, so I didn't ask for them. And then later, when I got older and I started trying to negotiate, I found that not everybody was thrilled that a woman was negotiating with them. And in some instances, I found that men were particularly uncomfortable with a woman negotiating. However, after I began studying negotiation, I became more competent and more confident, and I found when I negotiated that way, people were a little more accepting of it. Perhaps you're wondering why women are so much less likely than men to negotiate. Contrary to what some people think, it's not because women are nicer or kinder or more demure. It's in large part because that's how women are socialized. Women are socialized this way because society rewards and reinforces different behaviors in men and women. For example, self-promotion or touting one's competence tends to enhance men's perceived competence, but it poses a higher risk for women. Women who self-promote are perceived much more negatively than men who self-promote. Similarly, assertiveness and high task orientation enhance men's perceived competence, but make women seem less likable. So men who are assertive are perceived as masculine and competent, and women who are assertive are also perceived as masculine as well as bitchy. Finally, as I've mentioned, women are evaluated more negatively when they adopt what are perceived to be traditionally male authoritative leadership styles. That is, women are assertive when they ask for things. When they behave in ways that men are rewarded for, they're often punished. To help you understand the social and interpersonal dynamics of negotiating, I'm presenting on this slide the results of some of Babcock's research. What she did is she asked male evaluators and female evaluators to respond to men and women who were negotiating a job salary. In this experiment, some of the candidates were instructed to do what's called a hard negotiation. That is, they didn't just ask for more money, but they negotiated pretty aggressively. She asked other candidates not to negotiate at all. Then after the evaluators had interacted with the job candidates, the evaluators were taken aside and asked to fill out some measures on their attitudes toward the job candidates. One of the measures they filled out was their willingness to work with each of the job candidates. If you look at the chart on the far left, it represents male evaluators' willingness to work with either male or female candidates. The dark salmon color represents male evaluators' rankings of male candidates who did not ask. The lighter pink there on the far left represents male evaluators' evaluations of male candidates who did ask. The male evaluators rated their willingness to work with men who did not ask at 4.1. Their evaluation of men who did ask was 3.75. Although this is a small difference, it's not a significant difference. In other words, male evaluators were equally likely to want to work with men who asked as those who did not ask. However, if you look to the right side of that graph, where it says female candidate, again, the long dark bar represents male evaluators' willingness to work with women who did not ask, and the pale pink bar represents male evaluators' willingness to work with women who did ask. The male evaluators rated their willingness to work with women who did not ask at 4.85. However, they rated their willingness to work with women who did ask at only 3.43. As you might expect, this is a significant difference. In other words, male evaluators were equally likely to want to work with men who did and did not ask. When it came to women, however, they were much more willing to work with women who did not ask versus those who did ask. In fact, they preferred to work with women who did not ask above all others, and their least favorite people to work with were women who did ask. Now, if you look at the chart on the far right side, this chart tracks female evaluators' rankings of men and women who asked versus those who didn't ask. As you'll notice, there are no sex differences. In other words, female evaluators did not differentiate on the basis of sex. However, they did differentiate between those who asked and those who didn't ask. If you look at the chart, you'll notice that they evaluated men and women who don't ask at 4.5. In contrast, they evaluated the men and women who did ask at 3.4. And again, as you might suspect, this is a significant difference. In other words, female evaluators are less willing to work with both men and women who ask compared to men and women who don't ask, and they don't have a preference for men versus women based upon whether they ask or not. In sum, male evaluators penalize women, but not men, for initiating compensation negotiations. This might be because asking violates men's ideas of feminine niceness. Other research has indicated that when facing a male evaluator, women are less likely to negotiate than are men. It could be that the prospect of negotiating with a man makes women more nervous than it does men. And as the previous slide indicated, female evaluators penalize both men and women. That may be because they believe that asking is not nice and perhaps is overly demanding. However, again, other research indicates that when facing female evaluators, there are no sex differences in the propensity for men and women to initiate negotiations. This is unfortunate since we now know that female evaluators penalize both men and women who attempt to negotiate.